it's Matt here from MTG Dreamland. I want to thank you all for tuning into this week's standard episode of Jank or Junk. I'm pretty excited to get a brew going for standard right now because the format is in an absolutely great place at the moment. I've always been a sucker for tribal strategies, so this week we're going to be taking a peek at a deck that's been around in some form or another since Ixalan, and that deck is white-black vampires. I think that with Kaladesh and Amonkhet having rotated out, as well as the new candy that we picked up from Dominaria and Guilds, Vampirina's cousins are in a great place to step onto a more competitive stage. The deck list is pretty standard for what you would expect to see from a creature-based deck with 21 creatures, 17 spells, and 22 lands. In the creature base, we have 4 2-drops that all give us some sort of utility, either through casting them or just having them on the battlefield. Our 4 Adanto Vanguards offer us an undercosted beater that has the added ability of being able to trade 4 life to become indestructible. Our 4 Dusk Legion Zealots help us to draw extra cards to advance our board state, and 4 Martyr of Sands are 2/1s that replace themselves with a lifelinking token. The last 2-drop slot is dedicated to a 4 of Legion's Lieutenant, which pumps all vampires that we control by 1/1. Our 3-drop slot is filled by 3 Blood Operatives. This is the card from Guilds that really got me wanting to build a vampire list because it has an ETB effect that lets us exile a card from a graveyard. And for any of you who are familiar with the current standard meta, you know just how great this ability is in the main deck against decks using the graveyard like Golgari Midrange and Grixis Control. And finally, our Fatty 5-drop is a 2 Champion of Dusk. Champion helps us get damage through the air as well as giving us a card draw in the late game when we most likely have exhausted our hand. The life loss shouldn't be a huge issue because our deck is pretty good at gaining life throughout the game. For our spell package, we're running 5 pieces of removal in the form of 2 Cast Down and 3 Moment of Craving, which should help us get through a lot of matchups where the other deck's just as aggressive as we are. The life gain off of Moment of Craving is also going to help us stabilize against decks like Mono Red Steamkin, which will normally get us down pretty quickly. For enchantments, we have 3 copies of Radiant Destiny, 1 Legion's Landing, and 1 Arguel's Bloodfast. Radiant Destiny is an enchantment that gives all creatures we control of a named type +1/+1, and additionally, if we have the City's Blessing, all of our creatures are going to get Vigilance as well. Legion's Landing gives us a 1/1 life linker when it enters the battlefield, and if we attack with 3 creatures at once, it transforms into a land that has the ability of letting us pay 2 and a white to tap it and create a 1/1 life linker. This is great if you have extra mana at your opponent's end step. You can just pump out a creature at instant speed. Arguel's Bloodfast is also an enchantment that has the ability to transform, but most of the time we get more utility out of having it as a permanent that just allows us to use our life total and extra mana as a resource to draw us extra cards. Pride of the Conquerors is an instant that buffs our creatures by +1/+1 until the end of the turn, unless we have the City's Blessing. If we have the City's Blessing, Pride of the Conquerors gives all of our creatures +2/+2 instead. This is a great card to use as a combat trick to either sneak in extra damage if your opponent hasn't blocked, or as a way to pump up your creatures to make some valuable trades, especially if you're using a token with lifelink as a blocker. Finally, we're running 4 Call to the Feast to help us spam vampires onto our board. The vampires created by Call to the Feast all have lifelink, which makes them great as disposable attackers or blockers, especially when used in conjunction with Radiant Destiny or Pride of the Conquerors. For the mana base, it's a pretty straightforward 22 land setup with 4 Isolated Chapel, 4 Unclaimed Territory, a single Memorial to Folly, and our basics. I'm sure that you've noticed just by looking that we're leaning a little bit heavy towards the swamp in this mana base, but that is because we're running cards that have double black in their casting costs. And I also think that we should be able to get away with only running 22 lands because the majority of our deck is under 3 CMC, with just the few exceptions like Champion of Dusk and Call to the Feast. We also have access to Legion's Landing, which is able to transform into a land, so in a way I guess you could say we're running 23 lands in total. Finally, in the sideboard we're running 2 copies of Duress to help us get through control matchups, Divest to help us rip problematic creatures like Carnage Tyrants or Vine Mares out of our opponent's hands, and 3 Price of Fames to sub out for the Moment of Cravings for when Moment of Craving is just too small to really hit any of our opponent's creatures to be worthwhile. Another thing to note with Price of Fame is that it has a pretty sweet synergy going on with Blood Operative, because the Surveil mechanic that's attached to the Price of Fame allows us to dig Blood Operative out of our graveyard and put it back into our hand. Militia Bugler comes in when we need to race our opponent, particularly against other aggressive decks where having a larger board state is going to give us the advantage. Settle the Wreckage is great to bring in to help our opponent find some lands if they decide to swing a full board at us. And Sentinel Totem is relatively straightforward. We bring that in whenever our opponent's trying to abuse the graveyard in some way. I'm generally thinking about Golgari Reanimator or some dimmer variants here. And finally, the Ajani is going to come in against mid-range strategies to help our creatures get a lot taller to better fight against creatures like Jadelight Ranger, and to also help us fish out lords from the bin and put them back into the fight. So that's going to wrap up our deck tech for White-Black Vampires in Standard. I really hope that you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button so that way you can stay up to date with all of our new content. That's going to be all for now, and I really hope to see you in the gameplay videos.